The scorching San Diego sun beat down on the asphalt that summer afternoon. Heat rippled through the air, distorting the view of the nearly deserted streets of the Oak Park neighborhood. Amid this scorching scene, Amari Johnson walked slowly, her black skin glistening with a thin layer of sweat. His eyes, tired after a long shift at the hospital where he worked as a nurse, absently roamed the familiar facades and stores. Amari sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the day on her shoulders. He looked forward to the moment when he would get home, take a refreshing shower and rest. His thoughts wandered between the patients he had treated, the lives he had touched, when the shrill sound of a siren cut through the air, snapping him out of his reveries. A police cruiser stopped abruptly next to him, wheels screeching on the asphalt. Before Amari could process what was happening, the driver's door opened violently and an imposing figure emerged, Officer Rick Sanchez. Rick was known in the neighborhood, but not for positive reasons. His angular face, marked by years of service and a permanent expression of disdain, was especially feared by the African American community. His eyes, cold as steel, fixed on Amari with a disturbing intensity. "Hey, you there," Rick's voice boomed, echoing through the empty streets. "What do you think you are doing?" Amari froze, her heart racing. Confused, he looked around, trying to understand the reason for the approach. "Sorry, officer," he replied, keeping his voice calm. "I'm just heading home after work." Rick moved forward, invading Amari's personal space. His hot, sour breath hit the nurse's face. "Don't play dumb with me. You were smoking in a prohibited area." The accusation took Amari completely by surprise. He had never smoked in his life, much less at that moment. "Sir," he began, trying to maintain his composure, "there must be some mistake. I am not smoking, nor do I smoke." Rick's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you calling me a liar, boy?" His right hand rested menacingly on his gun holster. At that moment, Amari noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. Some people had come out of their homes, attracted by the sound of the argument. Some had their cell phones in hand, recording the scene as it unfolded. "No, sir," Amari replied, feeling a bead of cold sweat run down his back. "I'm just saying I wasn't smoking. You can search my pockets if you want. I don't have anything illegal on me." Amari's offer seemed to enrage Rick even more. With a quick and violent movement, he grabbed Amari's arm, twisting it behind the nurse's back. "Enough talk," Rick growled. "You are detained for contempt of authority." Amari felt a sharp pain run through her arm. "Please, officer," he begged, his voice shaking with pain and fear. "I did nothing wrong." But his words fell on deaf ears. Brutally, Rick forced Amari against the hot hood of the police car, pressing her face against the scalding metal. The smell of ozone and burning rubber filled Amari's nostrils, mixing with the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. As Rick handcuffed Amari with unnecessary force, the crowd of spectators grew. Voices of protest began to rise, some people shouting for the police officer to stop, others frantically filming with their cell phones. "Shut up, all of you," Rick shouted at the crowd, his face red with anger, "or you all go to jail for obstruction of justice." But the cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of the abuse of power unfolding before them. Amari, pressed against the squad car, felt a mixture of emotions: fear, anger, humiliation swirling in his chest. "Please," he whispered, more to himself than to Rick, "someone help." As if in response to his silent plea, a voice rose above the din of the crowd. "Hey, officer, we have everything recorded. You can't do this." It was Mrs. Martinez, an elderly woman who lived in the house opposite. She was standing on her porch, her cell phone pointed firmly at the scene. For a moment, Rick hesitated, his eyes scanning the growing crowd, cell phones pointed at him like silent weapons. But then, as if deciding he had gone too far to turn back, he violently opened the back door of the cruiser and pushed Amari inside. "You didn't see anything," he shouted to the crowd before getting into his car and speeding off, leaving behind a cloud of smoke and outrage. As the police car drove away, Amari, squeezed into the back seat, felt the tears he had been holding back finally escape. He thought about his family, his work, everything he could lose because of this unfair incident. But in the midst of despair, a small flame of hope lit up in his chest. People had seen it. They had recorded it. The truth would come out. What Amari didn't know, as the police car cut through the streets of San Diego towards the police station, was that this incident would only be the beginning. The video of his wrongful arrest was about to go viral, setting off a series of events that would shake up not only his life but the entire San Diego Police Department and beyond. The fight for justice was just beginning, and Amari Johnson had unwittingly become its symbol. The video of Amari Johnson's arrest spread across social media like wildfire. In a matter of hours, millions of views, shares, and outraged comments flooded the internet. The hashtag Justice for Amari became a national trending topic, and the pressure on the San Diego Police Department was growing by the minute. In the center of this media storm, sitting in a cold, impersonal cell, Amari tried to process the events of the last 24 hours. His back hurt from the brutal treatment he had received, but it was the pain in his chest, a mixture of fear, anger, and helplessness that tormented him most. Mr. Johnson, the soft voice cut through his thoughts. Amari looked up to see a middle-aged woman with gray hair and kind eyes standing on the other side of the bars. "I'm Patricia Alvarez, your court-appointed attorney." Amari stood up slowly, feeling every muscle protest. "Hi," he replied, his voice husky. I didn't do anything wrong." Patricia nodded, her eyes softening with compassion. "I know, Amari. I saw the video, as did half the country. We're here to fight for you." As Patricia explained the next legal steps, Amari felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The lawyer was talking about bail, preliminary hearings, and possible charges against Officer Sanchez. It was surreal to think that, in a matter of hours, his life had been turned upside down. Across town at the San Diego Police Department, Police Chief Robert Martinez faced a room full of reporters hungry for answers. His temples throbbed, and he could feel the sweat running down his back beneath his impeccable uniform. "The San Diego Police Department takes all allegations of police misconduct very seriously," he began, his voice steady despite the internal turmoil. An internal investigation was immediately initiated, and the officer in question was placed on administrative leave pending the conclusion of that investigation. The questions came like bullets. "Chief Martinez, this is not the first incident involving Officer Sanchez, correct? There are reports that other complaints against Officer Sanchez have been ignored in the past. How does the department respond to this? What does the department have to say to Amari Johnson's family?" Each question was like a stab, exposing the flaws and inconsistencies that Martinez had tried to sweep under the rug for years. He knew Rick Sanchez was a problem, but it had always been easier to ignore, to transfer, to downplay. Now, faced with undeniable evidence of Rick's brutality, Martinez felt the weight of his own complicity. Meanwhile, in a bar on the outskirts of town, Rick Sanchez drowned his rage in cheap whiskey. His eyes, bloodshot and bleary, were fixed on the bar's television, where his own image was repeatedly shown, accompanied by damning headlines. "Damn cell phones," he muttered, swallowing another sip of the drink that burned his throat. "Damn liberals. They don't understand what it's like to be on the front lines." The bartender, a burly man with arms covered in tattoos, gave Rick a dismissive look. "Maybe it's time to go home, officer," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm on the last word. Rick stood up abruptly, his chair falling back with a crash. For a moment it looked like he was going to attack the bartender, but then something in his eyes changed. A spark of fear, perhaps even understanding. Without saying a word, he threw some crumpled bills on the counter and staggered out of the bar. The next morning, Amari was released on bail, thanks to Patricia's tireless efforts and financial support from a civil rights organization that had taken on his case. Upon leaving the police station, he was greeted by a crowd of supporters, cameras, and microphones. "Amari, how do you feel? What do you have to say to Officer Sanchez? Are you going to sue the police department?" Questions bombarded him from all sides. Amari felt momentarily overwhelmed, but then she felt a firm hand on her shoulder. It was Patricia. "You don't need to talk to anyone right now," she said softly. "Let's take him home." But Amari knew she needed to say something. Not for him, but for everyone else who had gone through similar situations and had no voice. I just want justice," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "Not just for me, but for everyone who has ever experienced police abuse. This has to stop." His words, broadcast live to millions of viewers, touched a raw nerve in the national consciousness. Across the country, people of all colors and backgrounds identified with Amare's pain and outrage. In the days that followed, the San Diego Police Department's internal investigation took on an unexpected dimension. Other cases involving Rick Sanchez began to emerge. Former colleagues, encouraged by Amare's courage, went public with stories of racist and abusive behavior they had witnessed over the years. A former police officer, Sarah Ramirez, gave an emotional interview to CNN. "I saw Rick assault a black teenager during a routine stop. When I tried to report it, I was transferred to another district and labeled a troublemaker. I ended up quitting. No, I could no longer bear what I saw." Amare's case had become a catalyst, exposing not just the actions of one police officer, but an entire system that allowed and even encouraged such behavior. At home, surrounded by family and friends who offered unconditional support, Amare watched events unfold with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He knew that the fight was far from over, that there would be more obstacles and difficulties ahead. But looking at the messages of support flooding her social media, seeing the peaceful demonstrations taking to the streets of San Diego and other cities, Amare felt something she didn't expect: purpose. His unjust imprisonment, his moment of humiliation and fear, had become a rallying cry for change, and Amare knew deep in her heart that she couldn't and wouldn't back down from this fight. As night fell over San Diego, bringing with it the promise of another day of battle, Amare made a silent promise to himself and everyone who had ever suffered at the hands of cops like Rick Sanchez: change would come, no matter how long it would take. The storm that was brewing was not just one of indignation, but of hope. A hope that, from the ashes of this incident, a more humane system could be born, truly dedicated to protecting and serving everyone, regardless of the color of their skin. Attorney Patricia Alvarez's office was buzzing with activity. Stacks of documents covered every available surface, and the air was thick with the aroma of strong coffee and determination. In the center of this maelstrom, Amare Johnson sat quietly, his eyes scanning the newspaper headlines spread across the table. Officer accused of brutality has history of complaints, San Diego Police Department under investigation. Amare Johnson case exposes systemic racism. Patricia entered the room, carrying another stack of papers. His eyes, although tired, shone with a mixture of determination and hope. "Amare," she began, sitting across from him, "the city is offering a settlement. They want to settle this out of court." Amare felt a lump form in her throat. "How much?" Patricia slid a paper across the table. The number printed there made Amare's eyes widen. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life. "They're desperate to hush up the case," Patricia explained, her voice filled with a mixture of disgust and resignation. "They want you to sign a confidentiality agreement and close the matter." For a moment, Amare allowed herself to imagine what she could do with that money. Pay off your family's debts, buy your mother a house, maybe even open your own nursing clinic. The temptation was almost palpable. But then, like a movie, the images of the last few days flashed through his mind. The fear in the eyes of the neighborhood children when they saw a police car. His mother's tears when she saw the marks on his body after his arrest. The faces of so many others who had suffered at the hands of police officers like Rick Sanchez. "No," Amare said finally, her voice firm. "I can't accept this." Patricia didn't seem surprised. A small smile appeared on his lips. "I figured you'd say that, but I needed to offer you the option." "What happens now?" Amare asked, feeling the weight of her decision. "Now," Patricia replied, her eyes shining with determination, "we fight." In the days that followed, the legal battle intensified. Amare's case, now widely publicized, has attracted the attention of civil rights activists across the country. Peaceful demonstrations took to the streets of San Diego demanding justice not only for Amare, but a complete overhaul of the police department. Meanwhile, Rick Sanchez faced his own personal hell. Isolated in his home, bombarded by death threats and hateful messages, he oscillated between anger and despair. In a moment of clarity, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he swore he would never use. "Hello, this is the Rehabilitation and Counseling Center for Police Officers. How can I help you?" The voice on the other end of the line was gentle, non-judgmental. Rick felt his throat tighten. I think I need help. At police department headquarters, Chief Martinez was facing his own crisis. An external audit had revealed years of negligence and cover-up of police misconduct. The pressure for his resignation grew every day. In a quiet conference room, Martinez faced a group of veteran officers. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice weary, "the time has come for us to face the truth. We have failed. Not just Amari Johnson, but the entire community we swore to protect." The silence that followed was deafening. Some officers hung their heads in shame. Others seemed ready to protest. But everyone knew deep down that change was needed. Starting today, Martinez continued, we will implement a new training program focused on racial awareness and conflict de-escalation. Every officer will undergo a re-evaluation, and any complaints of misconduct will be rigorously investigated by an independent commission. Martinez's words echoed through the room, carrying the weight of years of neglect and the promise of a better future. Meanwhile, Amari found himself at the center of a media storm. Interviews, testimonials, public appearances, his life had turned into a marathon of activism. But amid the chaos, he found a voice he didn't know he had. At an event organized by a coalition of civil rights groups, Amari took the stage, facing a crowd of hopeful faces. "My story," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "is not unique. It is the story of countless black men and women who face prejudice and brutality every day. But today we are saying enough." The crowd roared in approval, and Amari felt a wave of emotion wash through him. "We don't want revenge," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "We want change. We want a justice system that truly serves and protects everyone, regardless of the color of their skin. And we will not rest until that becomes a reality." Amari's words were broadcast live across the country, touching hearts and minds. In homes, offices, and bars, people of all colors and backgrounds listened, reflected, and, for many, began to see the world from a new perspective. In the audience, Patricia proudly observed her client, who had transformed into a powerful advocate for justice. Beside her, Amari's mother cried silently, a mixture of fear and pride in her eyes. Meanwhile, in a therapy room across town, Rick Sanchez faced his own demons. I never thought I was the villain," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I always thought I was doing the right thing." His therapist, a middle-aged African-American woman, watched him with a mixture of compassion and firmness, recognizing this is the first step, Rick. Now the real work begins. As night fell over San Diego, the city seemed to be on the verge of a transformation. On the streets, in the meeting rooms, in the homes, and in the hearts of people, a change was taking place. It was painful, challenging, and often frightening. But it was necessary. Amari, lying in his bed that night, reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The fear and anger were still present, but now they were accompanied by something else, hope. Hope that his suffering was not in vain. Hope that, from the ashes of this tragedy, a more just and egalitarian future could be born. The rising sun painted the San Diego sky with shades of pink and orange, a spectacle of beauty that contrasted drastically with the tension hanging over the city. At the federal courthouse, a crowd had gathered, their voices an anxious murmur that echoed through the adjacent streets. Amari Johnson adjusted his tie, his hands shaking slightly. The suit he wore, borrowed from his uncle, felt heavy on his shoulders, as if it carried the weight of an entire community's expectations. "Are you ready?" Patricia Alvarez's voice was soft but firm. His normally sharp eyes were softened by a mixture of pride and concern. Amari nodded, swallowing hard. "As ready as I can be." As they walked towards the courthouse entrance, the crowd parted, creating a corridor. Faces of all colors and ages turned to Amari, some offering encouraging smiles, others with tears in their eyes. An elderly woman reached out, touching Amari's arm gently. "We're with you, son," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Amari felt a lump in her throat. Those people were not just there for him, but for everyone who had suffered similar injustices. Their struggle had become a symbol of something much greater. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with expectation. Judge Thomas Ramirez, known for his impartiality and commitment to justice, watched the room with watchful eyes. On the prosecution side, District Attorney Michael Chen organized his papers, his expression a mask of professional determination. And then the side door opened and Rick Sanchez walked in, escorted by his lawyers. Amari felt a shiver run down her spine at the sight of the man who had changed her life so drastically. Rick seemed smaller somehow, his previous arrogance replaced by an expression of defeat, and surprisingly, something that resembled remorse. Judge Ramirez banged his gavel, silencing the room. "We are here today for the trial of the state of California v. Richard Sanchez," his voice boomed through the room. "Mr. Prosecutor, may you begin with your opening statement?" Michael Chen stood up, his eyes scanning the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not just about an isolated incident. It is about a pattern of behavior, a culture of impunity that allowed an officer sworn to protect and serve to repeatedly abuse his power." As Chen detailed the charges against Rick, Amari watched the jury's reactions. He saw shock, outrage, and, on some faces, a flash of recognition, as if they finally understood the reality that many lived every day. When it was time for Amari to testify, he felt as if every step to the witness stand was in slow motion. He looked out into the gallery, seeing his mother's silent tears streaming down her face, and his friends from the hospital offering encouraging smiles. "Mr. Johnson," Prosecutor Chen's voice brought him back to the present moment. "Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that afternoon?" Amari took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice, initially shaky, gained strength as he described not just the events of that day, but a lifetime of microaggressions, of constant fear, of having to navigate a world that often saw him as a threat before he even knew it. That day. Amari concluded, her voice thick with emotion, "It wasn't just me being wrongly accused and attacked. It was as if every black person who had ever suffered at the hands of those who were supposed to protect us was being attacked again. And that's why that I'm here today. Not just for justice for me, but for change for all of us." A heavy silence fell over the room as Amari finished her testimony. Even Rick's defense attorney seemed shaken, his cross-examination more a formality than a true challenge to Amari's testimony. When Rick Sanchez was called to testify, the tension in the room was palpable. The ex-cop took the witness stand, his eyes briefly meeting Amari's before looking away, filled with shame. "Officer Sanchez," his lawyer began, "can you tell us what happened that day from your perspective?" Rick cleared his throat, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "For years, I convinced myself that I was doing the right thing, that my aggressive approach was necessary to keep the streets safe. But that day, and many others before it, I wasn't protecting anyone. It was the danger." A murmur ran through the room. No one, not even Rick's defense team, expected such a frank admission. "Mr. Johnson," Rick continued, turning to face Amari directly, "I am sorry. My actions were unforgivable, and I understand if you can never forgive me. But I want you to know that your words, your courage in standing up against injustice, forced me to face the truth about who I have become. And for that, as difficult as it is to admit, I am grateful." Rick's words hung in the air, filled with regret and a spark of hope for redemption. Amari felt a confusing mix of emotions, anger, compassion, and an unexpected realization that the change he sought was beginning to happen, right there before his eyes. When the jury retired to deliberate, the atmosphere in the courtroom was one of tense expectation. Hours passed, which felt like days. Finally, the jury returned, their serious faces carrying the weight of their decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant Richard Sanchez guilty on all counts." The room erupted in a mix of applause and suppressed sobs. Amari closed her eyes, feeling a wave of relief and, surprisingly, a pang of sadness. Not for Rick's condemnation, but for the realization of how much suffering could have been avoided if people simply saw the humanity in each other. In the weeks that followed, San Diego saw seismic changes in its police department. New training programs were implemented focusing on racial awareness and conflict de-escalation. An independent civilian commission was established to oversee police actions. And, most importantly, an open and honest dialogue began between the police and the communities they served. Amari, now a recognized face in the fight for justice, found himself at the center of these reform efforts. He spoke at schools, participated in roundtables with community leaders and police officials, always emphasizing the need for mutual understanding and systemic change. On a sunny afternoon months after the trial, Amari stopped in front of the San Diego Police Department. A new mural covered the side wall of the building, depicting diverse faces united under the words "Protect, Serve, Respect." It was a small step, but a powerful symbol of change. While looking at the mural, Amari reflected on her journey. The fear and anger that once consumed him had transformed into something more: determination, hope, and an unwavering commitment to justice. He knew the road ahead was still long, that a court ruling and some reforms would not eradicate centuries of prejudice and inequality. But there in the San Diego sun, Amari Johnson felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that step by step, word by word, action by action, they were building a more just and equal future for all. And with hope in his heart, Amari turned his back on the mural and walked towards the future, ready to face the challenges that would come, knowing that he was no longer alone in this fight.